Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Long Weekend, Life in the English Country House, 1918 to 1939, by Adrian Tinniswood, narrated by Stephen Crossley. People who formerly lived in very large houses are now getting out of them. As to who goes in is another matter. Country Life, October the 25th, 1919. "It's rather sad," she said one day, "to belong as we do to a lost generation. I'm sure in history the 2 wars will count as 1 war, and that we shall be squashed out of it altogether, and people will forget that we ever existed. We might just as well never have lived at all. I do think it's a shame." Nancy Mitford, The Pursuit of Love, 1945. Forward. There is nothing quite as beautiful as an English country house in summer. And there has never been a summer quite like that Indian summer between the 2 world wars, a period of gentle decline in which the sun set slowly on the British Empire and the shadows lengthened on the lawns of 1,000 stately homes across the nation. At least that is the conventional view of a period that has always been seen as witnessing the end of the country house. One by one, so the story goes, the stately homes of England were deserted and dismantled and demolished, their estates broken up, their oaks felled, and their parks given over to suburban sprawl. There's certainly truth in that, but it masks an alternative narrative that exists side by side with the familiar tale of woe. A narrative that saw new families buying, borrowing, and sometimes building themselves a country house, which introduced new aesthetics, new social structures, new meanings to an old tradition. A narrative, in fact, that saw new life in the country house. That is what The Long Weekend is all about. 1. The House Party. In 1931, John Galsworthy, the gentle chronicler of a passing age, captured the essence of a certain type of interwar house party in all its lovely, lazy, languorous tedium. "One day is very like another," he wrote. "The men put on the same kind of variegated tie and the same +4s, eat the same breakfast, tap the same barometer, smoke the same pipes, and kill the same birds. The dogs wag the same tails, lurk in the same unexpected spots, utter the same agonized yelps, and chase the same pigeons on the same lawns. The ladies have the same breakfast in bed or not, put the same salts in the same bath, straggle in the same garden, say of the same friends with the same spice of animosity, 'I'm frightfully fond of them, of course,' pore over the same rock borders with the same passion for portulaca, moss roses, play the same croquet or tennis with the same squeaks, write the same letters to contradict the same rumours, or match the same antiques." Perfect. Yet in defining the house party and pinning down the sameness, Galsworthy allowed something of its infinite variety to escape. Country house parties were not all the same. Some were small intimate affairs involving half a dozen old friends. Others were big and formal and packed with dignitaries. In November 1934, for example, the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire entertained 20 guests at Chatsworth for one of their grandest parties. Guests of honour were the Princess Royal and the Earl of Harewood, who hadn't visited since 1921, when the Earl, then Viscount Lascelles, proposed to his princess. Shooting parties were laid on for the Saturday and the Monday, and the Devonshires invited a glittering gaggle of acquaintances for the weekend to meet the royal couple, including the Duke and Duchess of Portland from Welbeck Abbey, the Marquis and Marchioness of Londonderry, art historian Kenneth Clarke, and Conservative politician Lord Hugh Cecil. Some house parties lasted no more than 48 hours. Others went on for an awfully long time. In Scotland, a long train ride from London, an invitation to shoot often meant a visit of 3 weeks. Besides meeting royalty and shooting, many parties were convened for a particular purpose. In January 1935, Chips Channon and his wife drove up to Lincolnshire to stay with Lord Brownlow, better known as Peregrine Cust, the courtier who the following year would take Wallis Simpson to France while her lover renounced his throne. Fellow guests at Brownlow's 17th-century Belton house were Duff and Diana Cooper, Viscount and Viscountess Weymouth, and Lieutenant Colonel the Honourable Piers Lee and his American wife. Channon was a little overwhelmed by Belton. It was almost over full of treasures, he thought, and his fellow guests were frankly bores. Being rude about the company was part of the fun. Harold Nicholson, who stayed with the Channons in Austria in September 1936, thought them a trifle vulgar. The real purpose of the gathering lay elsewhere. After dinner, the party set out in cars for an invitation ball the Duke and Duchess of Rutland were holding for their 2 teenage daughters at Belvoir Castle, 10 miles away. Channon was altogether more impressed with Belvoir. The ducal daughters both looked beautiful. Coloured lights in the trees lit the way up to the house, and the ball, with music by Emilio Colombo and his orchestra, was a glorious Disraelian festival, and the castle illuminations could be seen for miles. Violet, the 78-year-old Dowager Duchess of Rutland and mother of Diana Cooper, cut a particularly imposing figure in white, surrounded by her descendants, 30 of them, including a gaggle of small grandsons in black suits. A fortnight after the Belvoir Ball, the Rutlands hosted a small house party for guests who were going to a charity ball in aid of nearby Grantham Hospital. It was common, usual even, to host a house party for events like this: a trip to the races, a ball, a political gathering. The Earl of Harewood hosted one every year at Harewood House for the Doncaster races. The Duke of Westminster did the same for Aintree. In April 1932, Lady Warwick hosted a small party at Warwick Castle for Prime Minister Baldwin, Lady Warwick's brother-in-law Anthony Eden, then the Under-Secretary for Foreign Affairs, and their wives. They were also there for a purpose: to attend the opening by the Prince of Wales of the new Shakespeare Memorial Theatre at Stratford-on-Avon, which took place on Shakespeare's birthday, Saturday, April the 23rd. Like the Channons' visit to Belton and the Warwick Castle party, most country house parties were weekend affairs. Born out of a burgeoning railway network, there was, after all, no point in going away for a weekend if you spent the entire weekend travelling to where you wanted to be, and helped along by the rise in car ownership, the very word weekend had only just joined the lexicon of leisure. A contributor to Notes and Queries at the end of the 19th century wrote that in Staffordshire, if a person leaves home at the end of his week's work to spend the evening of Saturday and the following Sunday with friends at a distance, he is said to be spending his week-end at so-and-so. Was this usage confined to Staffordshire? He asked. By the 1920s, the country house weekend was an institution, although in polite circles it still wasn't actually called a weekend. The accepted phrase was Saturday to Monday. The Duchess of Buccleuch recalled that it was awfully non-you to call them weekends. I remember being surprised that anyone should use the term. The phrase also distinguished the leisured classes from those who had to be at work first thing on Monday morning, and for whom a weekend began on Saturday afternoon and ended on Sunday evening. People invited you for a Saturday to Monday, and that was precisely what they meant, said Leela Ponsonby. It would have been very rude to leave on Sunday night. How did it work? Whether a Saturday to Monday or a more extended stay, the country house party began with invitations given and received. Turn-of-the-century etiquette manuals were full of fiendishly complicated instructions on the theory and practice of invitations, how they must be worded, when they must be sent and how they should be responded to, along with dire warnings of the catastrophic social consequences of transgressing them. To widely depart from any of these received canons of etiquette, cautioned Maud C. Cook in the classic Manners and Customs of Polite Society, is to commit a decided solecism and discover an utter unfitness for the desired social rank. But the interwar years were changing times. By the early 1940s, Stephen Tennant could ask Sybil Colfax down to his Wiltshire country house for the weekend by simply writing, "Sybil, dearest, do come to Wilsford soon. Suggest a day. I will meet you at the station." To be sure, there were plenty of people who would regard that degree of informality as a decided solecism, if not a signal that civilization was teetering on the edge of extinction. But the times were changing. Laura, Lady Troubridge, a baronet's wife whose books on etiquette and entertaining were bestsellers in the 1920s and 1930s, announced in 1939 that "the new etiquette is informal. Remember, you are of your day and of your time, and therefore you will not be doing the wrong thing if you accept this new spirit and waive any petty, cramping little rules which were intended for another and far more formal age." What did it matter if you felt sleepy and got up to go to your room at a house party before your hostess had authorized your departure from the drawing-room, or invited friends to stay over by telephone rather than by letter, or use someone's Christian name when you had only just been introduced? Simplicity, that's the key word for social demeanour nowadays. Having accepted an invitation to spend a few days in the country, the next hurdle was deciding what clothes to take. "One's clothes were a worry," said Lady Marjorie Stirling, daughter of the Earl of Dunmore. Even for a 7-day shooting party, a woman was expected to dress for every day of the week. There were very rich people who had marvellous clothes, but on the whole one just scraped through. Lelia Ponsonby suffered agonies on her first visit to the Duke of Westminster's Eaton Hall, going down to meet the rest of the guests in the library that evening in a recently bought chiffon dress. A singularly inappropriate choice for December, she remembered with a shiver, and appearing the following morning in a reach-me-down green tweed suit. The Ponsonbys were always hard up. When Lelia came out, she had to recover her worn-out dancing shoes, dipping the heels in red ink and stitching black satin above the soles. Here again Laura Troubridge was on hand with words of advice. Avoid anything too smart. Otherwise, when you get into a muddy lane, you will wish you had chosen a classically plain tweed coat and skirt, the skirt wide enough to walk in, and the colour a soft tone to melt into the landscape. Once the invitation had been accepted and the right clothes were packed, the next step was to get to one's weekend destination. If that destination weren't too far from town, and sometimes even if it was, a leisurely drive was the usual option. In the summer of 1935, and on a Friday, Saturday to Monday seems to have been a movable feast, the Channons motored down from London to Longleat in Wiltshire. It was quite a long journey, well over 100 miles, and they took their time, stopping off on the way to picnic and have a snooze in a field. Everything was quite relaxed, as was their reception. "We found the splendid domain lying in the full heat of a June day," Chips wrote in his diary, "with its amber stone, gardens, dogs, and almost overpowering beauty." Lelia Ponsonby's arrival at the Earl of Lonsdale's Lowther Castle in the 1920s was anything but relaxed. She and her mother travelled up to the Earl's Westmoreland house by train, and they were greeted on the platform at Penrith Station by a groom clad in buckskin breeches, high boots, a cloth coat in the Lonsdale yellow, and a beaver hat. He conducted them to a coachman waiting in an open yellow landau drawn by a pair of cream-coloured horses, and when the two women were safely ensconced, the groom leapt up beside the liveried coachman, and the landau set off on a stately progress through the town, leaving the Ponsonby's luggage to follow in a yellow van. When Marmaduke Furness invited Thelma Converse up to his shooting lodge near Inverness in August 1925 for the start of the grouse season, she also went by train. So did he, and his staff, valet, 3 footmen, and 2 housemaids. Thelma had barely settled into her compartment before the valet knocked and informed her that dinner was ready. She found her host waiting in a sleeping compartment which his staff had converted into a temporary private dining room, with white tablecloth, champagne and ice buckets, and a picnic basket packed with all kinds of delicacies. "What, no plover eggs?" she asked, at which he took her in his arms and told her he loved her. A carefully planned stratagem with a predictable outcome. Lady Marjorie Stirling never forgot the social anxiety of arrival at a strange house. "I always found it very alarming, driving up a long drive not knowing what to expect," she said. "The door would be opened by the butler and you were ushered into a room full of people, nearly always strangers. It made me feel quite sick." It was usual to arrive around tea-time or soon afterward. When Wallace and Ernest Simpson drove down to Fort Belvedere to spend their first weekend with the Prince of Wales, they timed their journey to arrive at 6 on Saturday, bringing Wallace's maid Mary with them in the car. Sometimes guests arrived with their own personal servants, sometimes they came alone, in which case a resident footman or maid would be deputed to look after them. The Simpsons were greeted at the door by the Prince himself. He took them into the octagonal drawing-room and introduced their fellow guests. Thelma Converse, whose seduction on the night train from Euston had ended in her becoming Viscountess Furness and who had been the Prince's mistress for several years. Thelma's sister and brother-in-law, and Gerald Trotter, the Prince's groom-in-waiting. After the introductions, the Prince personally showed them up to their room. After dressing for dinner, the Simpsons were back down for cocktails, where they found the Prince dressed in a kilt, with a silver cigarette case tucked away in his sporran, working away at his needlepoint, and with 2 cairn terriers at his feet, one of which promptly tried to bite Ernest Simpson's ankle. Dinner was simple: oysters, roast beef, salad, a sweet and a savoury. Afterward, guests were invited to try their hand at a jigsaw puzzle, the pieces of which were spread out on a long table in the drawing-room, or to play a hand of cards. Bored, Thelma suggested dancing. The gramophone played Tea for Two, and the Prince took his mistress in his arms and whisked her away into the marble hall. After dancing briefly with Thelma's sister and Wallace, he announced he was off to bed. "This being your first visit to the fort," he told the Simpsons, "perhaps I should tell you about the rules. There are none. Stay up as late as you want, get up when you want. I go to bed early and get up early so that I can work in the garden." They came down to breakfast on Sunday morning and looked out of the window to see their host advancing across the lawn in a sweater and baggy +4s, and wielding a billhook. He invited them both to join him in hacking back the laurels. "It's not exactly a command," said Gerald Trotter diplomatically, "but I've never known anybody to refuse." Wallace, whose experience of country house parties had included several stuffy weekends at Knowle with the Sackvilles, was unprepared for the relaxed atmosphere at Fort Belvedere and the relatively simple domesticity of the Prince, whose reputation as a fast-living socialite was common knowledge. After a buffet lunch, the Prince showed the Simpsons round the fort. "What fascinated me," wrote Wallace later, "was the architectural wizardry that had been exercised in imparting to the interior of this sprawling fort such an atmosphere of warmth and informality. For a bachelor's country house, the whole effect was astonishingly warm and attractive." The Prince of Wales' easy-going approach to his weekend guests was in sharp contrast to the formality of entertaining in some of the great ducal houses, where many of the pre-war protocols remained firmly in place. Full evening dress had virtually gone out with the war, but dressing for dinner was still de rigueur, and black tie was the norm. Guests gathered in the drawing-room at about 7:30, where a butler assisted by a footman served cocktails. The worst form of drinking, according to Viscount Astor, because they were taken on an empty stomach and appealed to women and young girls. Particularly popular in the early 1930s were the White Lady, gin Cointreau and fresh lemon juice, and the Paradise, gin, apricot brandy and orange juice, both said to have been invented by Harry Craddock, the legendary barman at the American bar of the Savoy Hotel from 1920 to 1938. If it was a big party and most of the guests were strangers to each other, the hostess discreetly introduced each man to the woman he was to escort in to dinner. At 8 p.m. the butler announced that dinner was served, and the guests went in. At some of the grander houses and on more formal occasions, the strict order of precedence was followed, with the host leading the way and escorting the woman of highest rank, the woman second in rank with the man second in rank, and so on. The man of the highest rank would come last, accompanied by the hostess. Always consult a peerage or baronetage if in doubt as to the precedence due to expected guests bearing titles, warned a member of the aristocracy, the anonymous author of the 1916 edition of Manners and Rules of Good Society, that Bible of the socially insecure. Wealth or social position are not taken into account in this matter, it being strictly a question of date. With guests whose social rank was hard to determine, this raised all kinds of problems. Nearly 2 decades later, Elizabeth Craig told The Modern Hostess that there are no hard and fast rules about placing ordinary people like you and me at a dinner table. She advised that the only rules to remember where no titles were involved were to place the principal woman on the husband's right and the principal man on the hostess's right, and to separate husbands and wives where possible. Once everyone was seated, gloved footmen handed round the first course. They were supervised by the butler, who usually stationed himself close to his master's chair or by the sideboard from which he dispensed wines. Sherry after soup, hock with the fish, champagne for the rest of the meal until dessert, and then claret, sherry, port, and Madeira. White wine was served just chilled, champagne came ice-cold, and claret with a very slight warmth which was achieved by putting it on the hot plate in the server for a few moments. The typical country house dinner was a meal of Edwardian proportions. "For a big dinner party, a really posh dinner party," said Viscountess Hambledon, who entertained regularly with her husband at their country house outside Henley in the 1930s, "you would have either thick or clear soup, followed by fish, followed by the entree, chicken or quails. Then you had a saddle of lamb or beef, you had pudding, you had a savoury, and then you had fruit." A member of the aristocracy recommended that young women should steer clear of the more highly seasoned dishes. "Middle-aged and elderly ladies are at liberty to do pretty much as they please." They should also avoid artichokes because it was impossible to eat them elegantly. And, as a matter of course, young ladies do not eat cheese at dinner parties. Servants left the dining-room after dessert, and the women set off for the drawing-room 10 minutes or so later. Coffee was sometimes brought in a silver coffee-pot, and a woman would pour her own while the footman or maid held the salver. They were soon joined by the men. It wasn't fashionable any more to linger over the port for more than 15 or 20 minutes, just long enough for the wine to go round twice and for the men to smoke a cigarette. After-dinner entertainments depended on the party. Bridge was common, with several tables set up in the drawing-room. In most country house parties, bridge forms the chief if not the only amusement. declared manners and rules, and is played not only after dinner, but in the afternoon also. Dancing to gramophone records was popular in some circles, as Wallis Simpson had found at Fort Belvedere. On her first evening at Eaton Hall, Lelia Ponsonby was treated to that harmless worldwide after-dinner amusement, card tricks. Major Basil Kerr, the Duke of Westminster's agent for the Eton estate, and one of his closest friends, was a genius with a pack of cards, and he and Bendor entertained everyone with their patter and their sleight of hand. Musical recitals hadn't quite been superseded by the gramophone or the wireless. Mother and Sybil Thorndyke used to play duets, recalled Lady Molly Trevelyan's daughter Pauline. That's why there were always 2 pianos in the drawing-room at their house, Wallington Hall in Northumberland. John Christie, an Eton schoolmaster who took over the running of his family's 10,000-acre estate in 1922, was so fond of musical entertainments that he built a brand-new great hall at his rambling Sussex mansion to house a cathedral-sized organ, so that a friend of his, the recently retired organist at the Chapel Royal in St. James's, would have something to play. The organ room was the scene of concerts and operatic evenings for guests and local people throughout the 1920s, with Christie taking part along with professional and semi-professional musicians. He fell in love with one of these visiting performers, a young soprano named Audrey Mildmay, and after their marriage in 1931, conceived the idea of providing a larger space within the house as a showcase for her talents. The result was the Glyndebourne Festival, which opened its doors to the public for the first time in 1934 with a performance of Le Nozze di Figaro. Sometimes more contemporary entertainments were on offer. Lloyd George was a great film fan, and he used to hold regular Saturday night screenings in the study of his Surrey country house for friends, farm workers, and other local people. His chauffeur had lessons in how to operate the projector, and Lloyd George made the brave decision not to select the films that were sent down from London every Friday, preferring to take pot luck. At a recent Saturday night entertainment, reported The Guardian in 1928, the film turned out to be one of the crudest of love dramas, and at another, it was a Charlie Chaplin picture. Breakfast was much more informal than dinner. Women guests often preferred to breakfast in their room, as did some hostesses. Men began to assemble when the breakfast gongs sounded at 9 or 9:30, but it wasn't usual to wait until everyone was seated, and some guests might not appear until 10 or so. If she wasn't still in bed, the hostess would preside over the table, and footmen or maids were in attendance the whole time, serving eggs, sausages, bacon, and devilled kidneys from a hot plate, and ham, tongue, and game pie from the sideboard. When breakfast was over, which might not be until 11 or 11:30, the host and hostess would set out the options for the day. The vital thing was to keep people amused without making them feel too organized, said the Countess of Ross, a sentiment endorsed by the author of Manners and Rules, who noted that the good hostess's consideration and tact are so successfully exerted that somehow her guests always find themselves doing exactly what they like best and in company with those who are most congenial to them. At Hoker Hall in Cumbria, Lady Moira Cavendish used to make a list of who wanted to go riding, who wanted to fish, and who wanted to play tennis or golf. There were a great many activities to choose from, her daughter Diana remembered. Jigsaws were popular, left out on a side table in the library or drawing-room for anyone to contribute a piece or two. Guests might be taken to see an interesting local church or a picturesque ruin, or shown round the house where they were staying. During her visit to Westmoreland, young Lelia Ponsonby found herself being conducted round Lowther Castle by the aged Earl of Lonsdale, whose anecdotes grew progressively more extravagant as he moved from room to room. Lelia was surprised when he pointed out a small chamber where Mary, Queen of Scots, had been imprisoned until she made a...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?